The first government policy that we're going to look at is government price controls. So from a historical perspective, right, price controls are much less important in the US economy than they were throughout earlier times in history, right? So you've got a couple of big examples. One of them is World War II was a time that at the time President FDR instituted some pretty massive price controls, widespread throughout many different industries in the economy. Again, in that context of World War II, we're at war, and there's this huge ramp up in the government demand for goods and services, which is going to put upward pressure on prices. And so to try to keep prices in check, that was a big rationale for wanting to use price controls. Another one is in the early 1970s, right? And so you see with oil prices, petroleum prices getting higher and higher and higher, President Nixon came in and tried to put some price controls on different parts of the economy. In the 1970s, it was much less widespread and much more strategic, trying to put specific price controls on specific items and specific industries, but still much more widespread than what it is today, right? So today, you don't hear as much about price controls, though recently the discussion about prescription drugs, that's been an area where different candidates for president have talked about trying to use some price controls to try to keep drug prices in check. Price controls come in two flavors. They're either a ceiling or a floor. A price ceiling is simply the maximum limit that that a price for a good or service. The government steps in and they set the maximum a price can be. So prices can be lower, but there's this maximum amount that they cannot go above, whereas price floors are when the government sets a minimum price, right? Prices can be whatever they want. They can go as low as they want, they can be whatever they want, but there is some floor that places a maximum, so prices can't go below that. Both of them are limits on price, but notice that they're putting the ceiling or the floor, that cap, either on the maximum or the minimum. You can think about which side of the market might be more happy about this, right? So price ceilings are to try to prevent prices from getting too high. Who doesn't like high prices? That's consumers, right? And so the rationale for government price ceilings is that it's going to help out consumers. Price floors, however, are to make sure that prices don't get too low. Who doesn't like low prices? That's the producers, right? And so if the government's going to try to make sure that prices stay higher than some minimum, that's a policy to try to help producers. What you can't see, because this is a recording, is when I am saying the word help, I'm using quotes around that word, and we'll talk about some of the implications for these types of government policy and maybe why I'm putting the word help in quotes. Here we go. Price ceilings, price floors, either of these types of government policies, we can use the term binding and non-binding. They can either be binding, which means they have an impact on market outcomes, or they can be what we call non-binding. So a non-binding price ceiling or price floor, the government steps in, they put some limit on the market, but it doesn't matter because that's not where the price is operating anyway, right? So to think about a hypothetical example, broccoli, let's have the price of broccoli be let's do it $3 because it's easier to say out loud, right? $2.99, $3, that's fine, right? So if the government is going to put a price ceiling on the market, right? So again, we're saying that the price is actually $3. If the government were to step in and say, okay, right now, consumers, you are paying $3 for a pound of broccoli. What if we think that's too high? What if the government thinks that's too high and they come in and they set a high price of, say, $8? You can't charge a price more than $8. Does that matter? No, because right now, right, the price is only at $3. A price ceiling of $8 that's put it in the wrong place. A price ceiling of $8 that's above what the existing P-star price in the market of $3 is, that's not going to matter. That's a non-binding price ceiling. Whereas it's only when the government steps in and they set that price ceiling, that maximum amount, and it's below what the price in the market already was, that it's going to actually have an impact. If people right now are paying $3 for a pound of broccoli, but the government steps in and says, nah, that's too much. Let's instead make sure that broccoli won't be more than $2 a pound. That's going to matter, right? So this is the key. Binding price ceilings are those that are set below market equilibrium price. When the government steps in and puts a maximum value on, that's only going to be binding when it's set below what the market equilibrium price already was. Whereas for price floors, when the government's coming in and saying, no, 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 it can't go below this certain amount, we can think about, all right, so if it's right at $3, what if the government is worried about producers, broccoli farmers, and they want to make sure that they can make a good living, and so they want to make sure that the prices are high enough for them to have a good living? If they came in and they said, all right, prices cannot go below $2, does that matter, right? So if they say that the price floor is below, nope, put it in the wrong place again. If they say that the price floor is below what the price already is, it doesn't matter, right? A price floor is just simply saying it can't go below this amount, but if it's already above that amount, that's a non-binding price ceiling. Non-binding price floor. Whereas it's only when the government steps in and puts a price floor that's above $3 that it's going to be considered a binding price floor. So for example, right now the price of broccoli, farmers are earning $3 per pound of broccoli. If the government didn't think that was enough and they said prices can't go below $5, that would be an example of something that would actually have some kind of impact on the market. That would be a binding price floor. The first one, before that, some examples. So we've got a number of different examples of price ceilings throughout history. One of the most So the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is one piece of legislation that has a number of different things in it that allows the government to try to influence the price to help consumers. And so there's a lot of attempts at price ceilings, at least first steps towards price ceiling in different types of the healthcare industry. Specifically, one of the areas where they can do that is with health insurance. And it's a little complicated, but to make it a little bit oversimplified, right? Basically, this person, whoever is in this position, the Secretary of the Health and Human Services, they have an ability to review the health insurance premium increases for the following year. And if they think that those prices have gone up too much, there's certain action that they're allowed to do. Now, some of it has stronger teeth in it than other actions, but in general, right, there's different types of trying to control price. In that case, it's the rate of growth of price rather than price. Another one that we see a lot throughout history is the story of rent controls. So rent controls, right? We think about what's rent? Rent is what you pay on apartments, right? And so if you do not own, but instead you are a renter and you have a landlord, the amount of money that you pay each month, that's your rent, right? And so people worry about the affordability of housing. And so one of the policies that happens a lot is the idea of rent controls, where in order to make housing affordable for people who want housing, the consumers in that market, they put a limit on how much an apartment could cost. More recently, it's not that rent controls happen, but more recently, it's controls or limits on the rate of growth on how much rents can change from one year to the next, right? Again, rent controls were a policy that was much more popular a few decades ago, but you still see it as part of the discussion of how to get affordable housing. We can think about some different ways. We can think about what it looks like in the market. So what we're going to do first is we're going to consider the market outcomes of a binding price ceiling. Let's again just think about this as being the market for apartments. And I want to make sure that we go through and we think about what each of these different parts represent. So a couple of questions. One, what does the demand for apartments, who is that? The supply of apartments, who is that? What are they trying to do in the market? This equilibrium P star, if we're talking about apartments, what does that represent for buyers? Q star, what are we talking about? What does Q star represent in the market for apartments? So we've got, in this market for apartments, we've got equilibrium at P star, Q star. Remember the equilibrium condition, P star represents the value of the price such that the amount that consumers want to buy, as shown by the demand curve, is equal to the amount that sellers want to put out into the market, as shown by the supply curve. If we're at market equilibrium, I want to add, let's just start out here with the P star and Q star, and we'll do the welfare implications second. So if we've got, this is the market equilibrium value for price, what if the government steps in and says, hey, that price of apartments, it's just too high. To make it more local, right? So Ohio Northern is located in Ada, Ohio. Let's have the apartment value in that town be $400 per unit, right? And so if this is $400 per unit, then the demand curve, right, is going to tell us how many units people want to rent at a price of 400. Let's say that it's 200. I'm just making up some numbers here just so that you know, right? And at that price of 400, the supply curve tells us that the quantity supplied to the market at that price, at that rental price, is also 200 units. That's where we have our market equilibrium, where we have no shortage or no surplus, right? Think about that for a second. Is it reasonable to assume that most apartment markets in most cities have no shortage or no surplus? Is every single buyer able to find an apartment, and is every single apartment going to be rented out? Think about whether or not that's a reasonable assumption for this market, right? But it's the assumption that we're going to use here. Now let's assume that the city of Ada steps in and says, oh my goodness, $400, it's just too expensive. People can't afford a rent of $400, and they decide to put on a price ceiling. Now go back a second, and what do we know about price ceilings? A binding price ceiling is one that's set below market equilibrium. So if our market equilibrium is $400, if I'm going to add on a price ceiling, I need to place the price ceiling below market equilibrium. Let's say that it's a value of $300. And so I'll put a nice flat line there and label it $300 because it is the value of the price ceiling. Now again, if this price ceiling that's below market equilibrium, step back for a second, ask yourself, does this picture look a little counterintuitive? I always thought it did, right? And most people do. Why? Because where is the ceiling on this graph? It's below. It's at the bottom. It's below market equilibrium. Whereas in everyday life, you ask my 4-year-old daughter, where's the ceiling? She's going to point up. Right? That's why this is a little bit counterintuitive. But again, go back, check the definition of how we defined a price ceiling and how we came about the concept of binding and non-binding, and hopefully you can convince yourself that this is counterintuitive but correct. The binding price ceiling is below market equilibrium. So we can trace out if we had this binding price ceiling, what would consumers and producers like to do? Remember, this demand curve and the supply curve, it doesn't tell us what buyers and sellers get to do in the market. It tells us what they like to do in the market. At a low price of $300, the demand curve tells me how much quantity demanded is. If the prices were 300, this would be the level of quantity demanded, right? And again, I can do this in blue. We can do all these little tick marks represent different people showing up and wanting to rent an apartment. There's this increase above our market equilibrium. We've got more people showing up and want to rent an apartment. That doesn't mean they're going to get to. That means that's what they want to do, right? At these low prices, you see a higher quantity demanded. How about the supply curve, though, right? If we look at the supply curve, if sellers could only receive $300, the supply curve tells me how many units they're going to want to sell to the market, right? And notice, if I do the tick marks for the number of units that are going to be on the market at $300, some of those buyers are able to find an apartment, but many of the buyers are not. All of the units that are put out into the market for rent will get rented up. The problem is we've got all these extra people showing up who want to rent an apartment but aren't able to. Question for you, right? So is it clear? Think about the lower price. When prices went down, what's the logic to explain why quantity demanded went up? And also, what's the logic to explain why when prices went down, quantity supplied of apartments went down? So again, we've got in blue, those are all the consumers who show up and want to rent an apartment. In green, we've got all the rental units that landlords want to put out into the market. Some of our consumers in this market are able to find an apartment to rent. All of the units that producers put out into the market are able to be rented out. The problem is we have all these extra consumers show up. They want to rent an apartment at that price, but there are no apartments to be found, right? So what do we call this situation? What do we call this situation when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied? Is that a market shortage or a market surplus, right? So this market shortage usually is going to put what kind of pressure on prices? It's usually going to put upward pressure on prices. Why can't prices adjust up and eliminate this market shortage? Because the government steps in and says prices can't. The government is putting a lid on these prices, preventing the market forces from resolving this market shortage, right? If prices were allowed to go up, it would increase back until we were at equilibrium. That market process of eliminating the market shortage cannot happen because of this government policy. So here we go. Off to the right, I want to review the welfare implications real quick. So off to the right, I'm going to remind you that this is what the picture of market equilibrium looks like, right? Where we've got the demand, we've got the supply, and I've got in blue the consumer surplus, which is the area below the demand curve and above the price consumers were paying. In red, I've got the producer surplus, which is the area above the supply curve and below the price sellers were receiving to the market. You can keep that as a point of reference. Think about without the market equilibrium, where would consumer surplus and producer surplus be? I'll go ahead and put it on there for half a second, right? We've got the original consumer surplus and we've got the original producer surplus. And then I should be able to put these a little bit faded into the background. Okay, so hopefully you can still see in the background, that was my original consumer surplus, my original producer surplus. Now, when the government steps in and they put this policy in the market to help consumers of this binding price ceiling of 300, right? Where is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus, if you recall, is the area below the demand curve, right? So I'm still going to start at my demand curve, but I go from the demand curve down to the price consumers pay. Now, which one of these prices are the prices consumers pay? They used to pay 400, but now under a price ceiling, they don't pay a price of 400, they pay a price of 300, right? So it looks like my consumer surplus should go all the way down to that binding price ceiling. And how far to the right should I be calculating my consumer surplus? Remember that we only define consumer surplus over those goods that are bought and sold in the market. So I'm going to stop right there because those are the consumers who are actually able to find an apartment to buy. All of these other consumers, they show up to the market and they'd like to buy an apartment at the binding price ceiling of 300, but they're not able to buy an apartment. And when you don't make a purchase, when a transaction doesn't happen, there's no consumer surplus that's defined on it. So all of these consumers, they're showing up to the market, but I don't shade them in as part of the consumer surplus. Notice something, right, that we've got, let's see, what's a good color for this? Let's go ahead and highlight a couple of things these are some green polka dots right in here, right? That green polka dotted area in there, who did that used to belong to, right? Before the government stepped in and did a binding price ceiling, this area right here belonged to producers. Now who does it belong to? It belongs to consumers. How do I feel about that? That's just a redistribution of economic value, right? So it's just simply a redistribution of economic welfare. I don't mind that so much, right? So that's really just taking money from one pile and putting it into another, but I still have the same amount of money, right? So it's a redistribution of economic value. I don't worry about that so much. What I do care about is how about this little area right here that I'm going to shade in, right? This used to be consumer surplus. Now, who gets this surplus? No one gets this. No one gets this surplus. No one gets that welfare value. That is an elimination of a economic value. I care about that, right? In a sense, I think about these two areas, right? So if we have a room full of 100 people and everyone has $1, how much money does the room have? $100, right? But what if we took $1 from everyone that was wearing a blue shirt and reallocated all of that money that we collected to anyone who was wearing flip-flops? The room would still have $100. We'd still have the same amount of stuff. It would just be that different people had it. But what if instead we took a room of 100 people with each person having $1, and everyone who was wearing glasses, we took their $1 and then burned it? We'd have less money. That's the difference between these two regions, right? This is simply a redistribution. In the aggregate, we have the same total amount of stuff. This area that I just shaded in black, that's a destruction of economic value. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in half a second after we finish up the producer surplus. So where's the producer surplus? Recall, it's the area above the supply curve. So I'm going to start at the supply curve, and it's going to go up to the price that sellers receive. Now, when the government puts this binding price ceiling on, they're only going to be able to receive $300. And so how far to the right do I go? How many units do sellers actually sell in this market? Only up to there, right? So this is the new producer surplus. Notice again that there's this area of producer surplus that used to go to producers that now goes to consumers. Again, that's a redistribution. We've already talked about that, but there's this area that, oops, different color. This area that we want to shade in. This area used to belong to producers. Now it belongs to no one. We have a name for these two regions together. That area in black, we refer to that as the dead weight loss, the DWL, right? The dead weight loss represents the value of lost welfare, right? Usually this comes from a government policy, not always, but the deadweight loss is the value of the economic surplus that is foregone. In this case, foregone because of a price ceiling. This is the deadweight loss having to do with a price ceiling. So if we had to sum up, what was the situation with the impact on the market for a price ceiling? It looks like, I don't know, that area in blue. Is it bigger than what it was originally? It looks like there's actually some ambiguity there in terms of consumers, right? That they gained this area from producers, but they lost this area to deadweight loss. Are consumers better off or worse off? I can't really tell. What I can say is that it's going to really break out into two different areas, right? Some consumers will be better off. Some consumers are going to be better off. Those who are able to find the good at lower prices. But there's also some consumers who used to show up and buy the units, and they will not be able to find a unit to buy. It's not that these producers are mean and evil, right? It's just simply that they're not finding it in their economic value, their rational economic decision to produce these units. The supply curve tells the cost of production. It's not that these businesses don't want to produce that. It's just the cost of producing it can't be justified by this low price that the government is forcing onto this market. So we've got, for consumers, some of them are better off, some of them are worse off. Overall, it's a little bit ambiguous in terms of what happens in the aggregate to all consumers collectively. What we know for producers, though, producers are unambiguously made worse off. And the overall market, right, experienced this dead weight loss. There was a deadweight loss that was created, and that is, I don't use the word much, but that's something as an economist that I hate, right? I hate seeing economic deadweight loss because it represents economic value that has been destroyed in the market, right? Redistribution, I care about it as a secondary concern, but deadweight loss, that's a primary concern that I hate seeing a government policy do that as an economist, right? Another thing that we can point out about that's related to this concept of deadweight loss, if you recall, the demand, right? So how many units are actually produced? This is the level of production. This is how many units are actually bought and sold in the market. And if you recall from an earlier topic, the demand curve tells us that this is the benefit of that very last unit that was brought to the market, whereas the supply curve tells us that this is the cost of the very last unit to the market. Notice that there were all of these units that used to be produced where their benefits would totally justify the cost of producing those to the market, right? When we produce less than Q star, that's a form of inefficiency, right? Deadweight losses introduce an inefficiency to the market. They create the market, they cause the market to be inefficient. That's the story of price ceilings. We took a fair amount of time on it, more than what we're going to do with price floors. Price floors actually don't take quite as long for us to talk through. Price floors are the opposite. It's when the government makes sure that prices don't go down below a certain level. It's usually to help producers. Two that you may be familiar with. One that you're probably most familiar with is the idea of a minimum wage, right? Think about what is the minimum wage. The minimum wage is literally for most labor, not all, but for most labor, you cannot pay below this amount. You can pay more, you can't pay less. Another common form of price floors happen in the agricultural sector, where there's different kind of price supports to make sure that that the price of agricultural products stay higher. It's a little complicated because there's actually many different mechanisms that the government can use to create a price support or a price floor in the agricultural market. Whereas for the minimum wage, it's basically by fiat, right? Where the government just dictates this is what the minimum wage is going to be, and they require that everyone follow that. So we can, again, if we think about this as a labor market, again, we can ask some questions. If this is the labor market, think about, what does the demand for labor represent? Who is that? What does the supply of labor represent? Who is that? How about the price in a labor market? What does it represent? How about the Q star in a market? What does it represent? So we can think about, right, if we've got equilibrium in this market, equilibrium in the labor market, so that whatever the price of labor is, right, usually we refer to those as wages, right? Whatever the price of labor is, we've got equilibrium, where the quantity demanded of labor is equal to the quantity supplied of labor, right? We've got the quantity demanded of labor equal to the quantity supplied of labor. Now, if the government's going to come in and put a binding price floor, if they're going to put a minimum wage on the market that's binding, remember, what was the scenario for a binding price floor? A binding price floor is one that's set above what the price otherwise would be in the market. Remember that P star represents what the price would be in a market if we had free market forces, that there was no government policy of price floors or price ceilings. That's especially important for a way to think about what P star represents with markets for labor, because many markets for labor are dominated by the minimum wage, right? P star represents, if we thought about the demand for labor and the supply of labor, it would be the price that would cause equilibrium, right? So I like to think about two different kinds of workers. I like to think about subway workers, and I like to think about nurses, right? So my mother-in-law was a nurse. She retired a few years ago, but in general, right? Nurses. Do they make minimum wage? No, they usually make way more than minimum wage. So for example, right, let's just say that the average nursing salary is $30 an hour. If the government were to raise the minimum wage from $7.25 up to $9.25, are nurses impacted by that? No, it's non-binding in the market for nurses. However, for subway workers, right, and other kind of fast food workers, typically in many cities, not all, but in many cities, these workers are going to be making minimum wage. So if the government were to raise the minimum wage from $7.25 to $9 an hour, yes, that kind of labor market would be affected, right? What we're thinking about with P star is what the price would be based on supply and demand if the government was not in the market. For nurses, this is $30, and the price floor for the minimum wage for nurses are way, way, way down here. But that's not very interesting because that's not binding. Let's go ahead and show what the market equilibrium would be if we had not the labor market for nurses, but if instead we were looking at the labor market for minimum wage workers, right? What we know is that the minimum wage price floor, binding price floor, would be a value that's set above market equilibrium. So I'm going to want to draw it up here. Notice again, this is also counterintuitive. Just like with a binding price ceiling, it was counterintuitive because the ceiling was below market equilibrium. A price floor is also counterintuitive because when it's binding, it's set above what the price would be, right? So if this is the $7.25 for a price floor, I'm thinking about this as a federal price floor, and notice that different states and different cities may have higher, more local price floors like we do in Ohio, but the federal minimum wage is above what the equilibrium price would be. This is what would fast food workers in a rural town with not a high cost of living, what kind of prices would they make? What kind of wages would they make if the government wasn't doing this price ceiling, right? So you could think about when the government institutes this price floor, how does that impact buyers and sellers? But remember, demand, supply, who's who? The demand in a labor market, those are businesses, right? So if businesses have to pay higher prices, what do? The amount of labor they want is going to be lower. That makes sense, right? That they're just going to do some substitution. If their labor becomes higher, quantity demanded is going to fall. One of the interesting questions you could ask yourself is, my goodness, do we know anything about elasticity that might help us understand whether this decrease in quantity demanded is going to be a big jump or a little jump, right? It's very possible if we have inelastic demand that this increase in a minimum wage is barely going to have the quantity demanded fall that much, right? Depends on the elasticity. For the supply side of the market, right, we've got when prices go up, what happens? According to the supply curve, quantity supplied is going to increase, right? And think about whether or not that's a realistic assumption, right? So when I think about my mother-in-law as a nurse, right now, or when she retired, she was making about $30 an hour. But what if the price that she could earn, her wages, would go up to $70 an hour, right? Might she start picking up some part-time work, right? It's possible. It's definitely, we've got this theoretical explanation from this upward sloping supply curve that when wages go up, the quantity supplied is going to get higher. Again, does quantity supplied increase a little or a lot? Is it significant or insignificant? That's a question about the elasticity of labor supply. So this is a very, very, very standard presentation of a competitive market with labor, which we'll talk about later in this class about how maybe some of the assumptions about a competitive market for labor might be a little bit questionable. But even on top of that, right, the degree to which this is true, the degree to which there's a significant movement really depends on the elasticity. So here we go. We can take one other step while we're here, though. We don't actually want to do the welfare implications because it's very complicated. Again, it's based on exactly how the government structures the way that they do a price floor. And in agricultural markets, there's a number of different ways that they can do it. So we're actually not going to dive into the welfare implications right now. We're just going to focus on this market welfare. Question again, what do we call this kind of situation when the quantity demanded when the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded? And then we can add to it, what kind of pressure would there be on prices? Normally, we'd expect to see downward pressure to get us back at market equilibrium. But again, the market is trying to push these prices down, but the government is doing something that's keeping prices from getting any lower, right? So that's the basic story of price controls.